Chapter 20. Regression from Reality. Word traveled quickly between the kingdoms. While most grew up only communicating through word of mouth or letters later on, the completion of the schools and the work of Dr. Tim made the work much faster. They didn't know how it worked, but didn't find the need given that the instructor deemed it unnecessary. The only thing that gave the students concern was that this wasn't the only topic being phased out of their curriculum. Homework hours were easier, but the older students who knew their teacher could tell something was wrong. He had left notices for extended physical exercise and weapon training sessions, with substitutes filling in to supervise. Days of this turned to weeks until finally he simply wasn't there. No one assumed he had defected, but they were concerned. It had given the students the opportunity to get to know Tim more. Some appreciated this more than others, but the consensus view was still unnerved. The only people who could even recall the information they had been learning before the attack were those who went out of their way to find it. Libraries began stocking more and more works of fiction, and this frustrated a lot of students, especially Olivia. A loud bang was heard in a normally quiet environment. They were surprised to find a small girl was the source. She moved her head through her scalp and wished she could find hair there to pull on. A pile of books laid out in her wake, and the visible frustration she showed forced those around her to give her a wide berth. Vacchio was not short on able-bodied individuals who could have confronted her. An aura of unwillingness simply won the day. Gideon and Daniel were sitting nearby, who both looked to have Elia as to what may be wrong. She shook her head and shrugged, giving Daniel the assurance that it was stress. He made his way over and got on one knee and met her on eye level. "You okay?" He looked back at the pile of books she threw off the shelf. "I never took you as one who stressed over history." She cupped her hands around her eyes and brought herself close to him. He still didn't understand, but figured looking for warmth was a default for her anyway. "It's not there, Danny," she whispered between sobs. "What?" Daniel began. Olivia pushed him harder than he knew she was capable of and drew him to his feet.
"They took out the history!"
Eyes began to look away, and even some scoffs could be heard. He waited for her shoulders to drop and held out his hand. After leading her back to the table, Gideon and Havaliah exchanged a glance as they watched him sit her down and address the warden, who finally decided to ask if the situation was under control. He put the books back on the shelf and noted they weren't marked beyond category. With a nod, he joined his team at their table, and the room continued on like nothing had happened. They all sat quietly. Olivia buried her face in her knees, and Daniel rested his chin on his elbow, leaving them all to take in the implication of their observation. "Do you think they read our reports that quickly?" Havaliah voiced, not wanting the silence to linger any longer. An open hand from Daniel gestured to the shelves that had become increasingly more neglected in the reference section she knew better than anyone in the kingdom. "For an athlete, you were always a nerd, Leia." Gideon spoke candidly. She gave him a light punch on the shoulder. "You should have noticed before any of us." She let out a long breath that seemed to be an attempt to buy time before she gathered her thoughts. They said nothing. The open air carried another several moments before another individual made their approach to the table. They figured it was another comment about her breakdown and prepared themselves to explain on behalf of their teammate. Their eyes locked on the individual who took the open seat, realizing the one distinctive feature that set him apart from anyone else in Vacuo. Daniel was the first to speak. "You've gotten older." An endearing laugh followed that drew Olivia's attention from the floor. A faint smile began to form when she saw his white coat. "It's good to see you all again. May I ask if something's wrong?" Explanations were offered, including the correlation they couldn't help but find with their report. Tim continued to listen, offering little more than nods at regular intervals. His analytical posture may have been recognized by one of his colleagues, but to these students they could only assume they had his attention. He watched their body language like an equation, almost substituting what one could glean from a voice. Havaliah tried to match his question with as respectable an answer as she could. Yet no matter how heady her terms she used, it all seemed too low for a man that had literally designed their weapons. "You see, Dr. Nebo, this may be too little to conclude that Beacon has decided for all the kingdoms that history needs to be censored to prevent further terrorist recruitment. Yet this isn't the only time we've seen fewer material being made available even on our scrolls. We made a conclusion and sent it, alongside other proposals. The only thing that made ours stand out was that it concluded something a lot of people in this world don't want to face. The instructor brings these things to Beacon, and theology texts are the first to go. Then records of the war, then records beyond it. Olivia's not the only one upset by this. What do you do when your government not only starts buying into a lie, but has made hiding the truth the way of the future? He held his posture for a long while. Stone-faced, he eyed each of them individually, until finally drawing a breath to speak. If you came here to read history, would you mind if I told you some to pass the time? Avalaya started getting frustrated, but Olivia's arm halted her before that emotion could rise to the surface. The fact she was engaged was enough to put her at rest. He moved from Havalaya to Olivia as he began to speak. Do you still have my rifle? Olivia nodded and lifted it from her leg, causing it to automatically extend and form on the table. He looked at it with sad eyes and rested his hand on the hilt. I served as a sniper and an engineer during the Great War. If there's anything I could tell you that I took away from the training, it was that there was such a thing as evil. Daily training for us was making sure we understood three things: how to fight, how to react, and who were the enemy. Our propaganda wasn't as cartoonish as you would imagine it was. In fact, the arguments were very well structured. Humans came before faunus, and therefore their existence was a deviation. Those that preserved and promoted a deviation from humanity were by definition evil. He turned to Havalaya. Our God was the preservation of humanity, and humanity alone. Her response was non-confrontational, so he continued. Our first foray into combat was much like your own. Looking people in the eye weren't as easy as dealing with the grim or targets. We saw those same eyes in the mirror when we woke up every morning. And with the exception of a few types of faunus, we saw the same life in their eyes as our own. The training took over, and our responses for self-preservation went out the window. The first time I took the life of a vacuo citizen was from the air. Superior technology gave us a lot of advantages. It was after the battles that the conflict became complicated.